This time on Poll Hub, we're asking the increasingly relevant question, is it news or is it nonsense? With more people getting most of their news from social media apps and AI-produced videos and images flooding the zone, there is a lot of room for nonsense to invade. How do we deal with it? And what if we don't or can't? Then we're talking about one of those apps, TikTok. The US government is trying to force the Chinese government that owns it to sell it, or if they don't do that, it'll get shut down. There's a lot going on there, but what about the tens of millions of Americans who use it and others who make a living on it? We're talking to a TikTok star to get her perspective, and we finish with a Leeless fun fact. Can we even do that? It's about something so ubiquitous we barely think about it, even though most of us had never heard of it 30 years ago. Ooh, a riddle. Stick around. And hi, everybody. Welcome to Poll Hub. I'm JD Dapper.
I'm Mary Griffith.
I'm Hunter Petro.
And I'm Delaney Hayes.
Let's dive into the ever-evolving landscape of news consumption. With the rise of social media platforms like TikTok, Instagram, and X, misinformation is spreading faster than ever.
Yeah, and Americans are concerned. According to a December 2023 poll by KFF, 83% of U.S. adults believe that the spread of false and inaccurate information in the United States is a major problem. And YouGov's 2024 Trust in Media survey, which gauges the public's trust in a range of media sources, found that the most trusted news source was the Weather Channel. In fact, 43% of Americans reported it to be more trustworthy than untrustworthy. BBC and PBS, though, are the two public broadcasters that Americans seem to trust the most, with 25% and 22% of Americans, respectively, finding them to be more trustworthy than not. It's also worth noting that PBS is one of Marist's polling partners. Hunter.
Yeah, now there is a generational divide here. According to 2022 Economist/YouGov polling, Americans 45 and older are more likely to get their news from TV networks and their official websites, while younger Americans, younger than 45 years old, are more likely to get their news through social media. But you also need to consider the new devices on which people are getting their news. 58% of U.S. adults prefer getting their news on mobile devices, according to a November 2023 Pew Research survey. 27% prefer the television, and just 5% claim they get their news from the radio.
And if you take a deeper look, the preference for television has decreased by 10% in just 2 years between 2021 and 2023. It's definitely going to be interesting to see what the results of Pew's 2024 News Platform survey will show. Okay, so people aren't getting their news from the radio and television as much, and instead are getting news on their phones. So to which platforms are Americans turning?
Yeah, it's an important question. And in November 2023, Pew Research talked more in depth with those folks who said they get their news from a phone. About 25% of them said they use news websites or apps. 15% said search, and 12% said social media. Though when asked in November 2022 by Pew, U.S. adults under 30 ended up trusting news from social media almost as much as they trusted information from news organizations, with 50% saying they trust social media and 56% saying they trust national news organizations.
TikTok saw the biggest increase in respondents who regularly get their news from the platform, according to another November 2023 Pew Research survey. And in 2020, only 1% of U.S. adults claimed to get their news from TikTok. But as of 2023, that number nearly doubled to 43%. That, of course, is a 21% increase in just 3 years.
And just a reminder, this is on a platform that is banned in 16 countries, and that includes the United States.
Well, as trust in major news corporations begins to fail, people are left looking for other options. But this means that the consumer numbers for these news companies are taking a major hit. In a March 2016 Pew Research survey, 51% of Americans said they follow the news all or most of the time. That number dropped to 38% by August of 2022.
I wonder if it's a problem with all news or just the more well-known major news corporations. Because according to a May 2024 Pew Research survey, 71% of Americans feel their local news organizations do a good job at reporting the news accurately. Though it's important to note that the share of Americans who say they follow local news very closely has fallen by 15 percentage points since 2016, dropping from 37% saying they follow local news to just 22% saying they closely follow local news.
So could politics play a role? Recently, people have had increasing complaints about the media's bias in political reporting. So let's examine the division of the media along partisan lines. and see if that has anything at all to do with the growing distrust in the media. In June of 2020, an Economist YouGov survey asked how trustworthy people found each news channel based on political party. A majority of Republicans trusted Fox, 57% ranked it trustworthy, and mostly distrusted CNN and MSNBC. Democrats trust the Washington Post, clocking in with 65%, CNN at 64%, and the New York Times with 63%. And they least trust Fox News with 14% and One American News with 11%.
And joining us now to help put these numbers into context is Kevin Lerner, Associate Professor of Journalism and Chair of the Department of Communication here at Marist College. So welcome in, Professor Lerner. It's good to have you back on Poll Hub.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Yeah, so we'll start with just a quick question. So what do you think some steps are that major news corporations can take to rebuild trust with their audiences?
I don't know that it's necessarily the news corporations themselves that need to do that work. It's difficult because they are all living in one of the terms we like to use when we're talking about these organizations is we call them the legacy news organizations, right? These are the news organizations that existed sort of in the before times. And when you were running through those ages earlier, you divided at 45 years old. And I am not ashamed to admit I am 47 years old, which puts me essentially right at that borderline, right in the demographic split. And I grew up in a period prior to social media and really prior to the internet. I got my first real email address my freshman year of college. So essentially I had a childhood that was very different from my adult life, but my adult life hasn't really been all that different from what my students are living in. I've been able to absorb most of that. So these legacy news organizations are dealing with traditions and processes that existed in those before times, right? In that time prior to, say, the year 2000, when the internet really began to explode. And what they do is still pretty good. I think what we really need to be working on is media literacy and training people in understanding how the news works. And if the news organizations themselves, those legacy news organizations, have a role in that, it is in opening up their processes and explaining to the world what it is that they do. I've found in my research and in reading research of many of my colleagues who study journalism that journalists think that everyone knows what it is they do and how the news gets made. But the vast majority of news consumers really have no idea what goes into producing a news story. When I'll show students a 300, 400, 500 word news story, ask them how many sources they think that reporter talked to, they'll say 3. And it may turn out to be 50 that go into this. So much reporting goes into producing even something so short. So I think the short answer to your question about these legacy news media is they need to explain their processes.
Professor Lerner, It's interesting because you and I are contemporaries. I grew up with the legacy media and legacy journalism. And, this isn't the first time that emerging technologies has altered the way that journalism takes shape. So is this different? Has the emergence of social media changed that in any way, or is this just another step in the evolution of journalism?
My work as a researcher is actually as a historian, and I've looked at a lot of these periods when there were huge amounts of technological change. And I actually just finished reading The Powers That Be by the former New York Times journalist David Halberstam, where he looked at 4 major news institutions and how they changed over the 1970s. The rise of radio, the rise of television really did change the way that people consumed the news. Even before that, the rise of the steam-powered printing press suddenly made news available to essentially anybody who was literate. And we kind of take that for granted now, but in the 1830s, this was a huge revolution. The only people who read anything that we would think of today as public affairs news were educated elites. It was a very small group of people. It may still be that something like the New York Times is read by what we would today call educated elites, but it's accessible to a far greater number of people because of those. So I think each one of these technological revolutions brings new problems, and we are trying to figure out how to deal with these latest ones, but this is definitely not the first technological revolution.
And some would say that this technology in particular democratizes journalism. What's your take on that?
I think that's fair. So I'll shift generations for a second and talk about my parents' generation, right? So my parents were born in the baby boom right after World War II. And the news ecosystem up until 2000 and then even since then has been fairly stable, right? There were major network news organizations on television. There were a few national newspapers. There were magazines. But the ecosystem that they were getting their news from was stable for essentially their entire lives, almost up until retirement age. And so seeing a change at that point feels like it's been the same way forever, right? If you've lived in one news ecosystem for almost your entire life, any change feels very big. For somebody like me, a generation younger, it happened in early adulthood, so it feels a little bit more manageable. For my students who are, 18 to 22 years old, maybe this feels like the way it's always been now, and maybe it will be. But it feels like the pace of technological change over the last 25 years has been so fast that we're probably not done.
Yeah. And how do you think consumers can better identify and avoid this rapid spread of misinformation?
Boy, it's difficult. Particularly, you mentioned how popular TikTok has become. And I actually spent a good amount of time prepping for this interview by spending time on TikTok. And TikTok is not a native platform for me. It is not a place I would typically go to. And, what I've determined is you could get very good news from TikTok. News organizations that I have grown to trust in my expertise do have presences on TikTok, right? The Washington Post was very early on TikTok. They have somebody they call TikTok Guy, who is their personality on TikTok, and he interprets the news and he engages with readers. But even, the New York Times and the New Yorker have presences on TikTok. Now, is anybody watching 15-minute New Yorker documentary videos on TikTok? Probably not. I got sucked into one of them, but that's because they appeal to me. So you could actually do that. The problem with TikTok is a lack of citation, a lack of saying where their information comes from, a lack of linking out to things. And one I'm going to use air quotes here and call it a news organization, but one outlet on TikTok that my students have often referred me to is something called Bikini Bottom News, which it's a takeoff on, and probably actually copyright infringement on, a segment on SpongeBob SquarePants, the Nickelodeon cartoon, where a fish with an animated jaw recites news headlines. And on TikTok, it's the same thing. And some of the news is very real and well summarized. Some of it seems to be kind of conspiratorial or rumors or the kind of salacious thing you might find on the Daily Mail, the newspaper out of England, some gossip. But there's no sorting. Everything is kind of level and everything seems to be coming from the same place. So you might be getting some good news, but you might also be getting some rumors. And it's kind of hard to filter what the differences are. And I'll say too, when I went into TikTok earlier today to spend some time there, I went to the subscription page, right? I went to the group of accounts that I have chosen to follow. But that's not the default. When you open TikTok, it just throws things at you. And when I was there briefly before I tapped over, because the videos start playing immediately, right? I already got some things that I knew to be false information, things that had spread, things that were AI deepfakes, right? There was an AI deepfake of former President Trump reading a quote that has been thoroughly debunked as something he did not say. Years ago, in a previous election, this was debunked. So I was met with that in the first 45 seconds of being on TikTok.
So do you think that this significant increase in people getting their news from TikTok, specifically, younger people, it's pretty easy to say, do you think it's more harmful?
I think it's potentially harmful. I think it's dangerous because people who don't know how news gets made and where these accounts are coming from see everything at that same level, right? They're not differentiating between the things they want to trust and the things they don't trust. And there is a bit of a bias on TikTok toward stickiness, right? These videos want you to stick around because the longer you stay on a particular video on the TikTok algorithm, the more likely you are to get more videos from that creator in the future. So you're not going to be getting summaries of your local school board meeting. You're not going to be getting an analysis of tax policy. And if you do get something that's an analysis of tax policy, it's probably going to start with you're not going to believe what your politicians are doing to you, and then go into that analysis, right? It's going to be something that's going to sort of shock you and get you to stick around. So that is a little bit of a problem, and it's something that I think any consumer of news has to educate themselves on.
Before we let you go, Professor Lerner, what advice do you give your students who want to enter into the field of journalism, given the rapid change in the technology in the industry?
The thing I think is most important for somebody who really wants to be in journalism is to understand the best practices of journalism that are not tied to any particular technology. I'll go to an accepted students weekend and the parents will come in and they'll say, the news industry is falling apart. Why should I let my daughter go into this business? And what I'll say is, well, the business is in some trouble right now, but those underlying fundamentals of journalism are going to make it through. So if you're going to be a student studying journalism or somebody who's early in your career, be flexible. Know that change is coming. And honestly, it's a really exciting time to be an early career journalist because you're inventing the next new thing, right? Maybe you're going to be the one who figures out how to crack the TikTok algorithm and actually educate a younger public the news that's important.
Well, Professor Kevin Lerner, Associate Professor of Journalism and Chair of the Department of Communication right here at Marist, we thank you so much, as always, for joining us here on Poll Hub.
Thank you. It's always a lot of fun.
So we talked about TikTok in that last segment, and for good reason. It's the most important social media app for people under 45. It's where, especially people under 30, spend virtually all of their social media time. And as we talked about, there's some controversy about it because the federal government wants, the Biden administration, has mandated that the Chinese owners, ByteDance, of TikTok sell the app, American version of the app, although there isn't an American version, to an American company, or to close down. So there's been a lot of talk about TikToks being banned and all of that stuff. This went into effect in April, but it's in court, and so it doesn't go into effect until next year. And ByteDance is in court. They think they have a pretty good shot at overturning this because they say that the government's picking on one company. So TikTok's in the news for a whole bunch of reasons, but one of them obviously is that it is hugely popular, but it is also controversial.
So now that we understand the controversy behind TikTok, let's take a look at some of the public opinion and data surrounding the topic. A Reuters Ipsos poll found that 50% of Americans supported banning TikTok, while 32% opposed a ban, and the rest were unsure. It's important to note that the poll only surveyed U.S. adults. Therefore, it doesn't reflect the views of people under the age of 18, who actually make up a significant portion of TikTok users in the United States. So about 6 in 10 respondents aged 40 and older supported a ban, compared with about 4 in 10 aged 18 to 39. Republicans and Republican-leaning independents remain far more likely than Democrats and Democrat-leaners to support a ban, which is 50% versus 29%. So that's why the US government has taken action. But what about the tens of millions of American users? And what about people who are now making a career on TikTok? Well, today we have the pleasure of welcoming Maddie Schrader, known as Mubi on TikTok. Maddie, a recent graduate of Marist College and a former member of the Women's Lacrosse team, has garnered an impressive 886,000 followers on TikTok. And I must note, Maddie is one of my closest friends, so it is an honor to have her on today. And now she has begun her post-grad journey as an influencer while working for Barstool Sports. Welcome, Maddie.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
So first, Maddie, how did you get your start in TikTok? And is this the type of job you imagined having for yourself?
Or your parents imagined you having?
Yeah.
So that's a great question because I sort of always knew that I was never the type of personality to work in a cubicle, and I was never the best student, I could openly say. I first started on TikTok going into my junior year of college, and it was never something I was like, I see this as my career. It was sort of a creative outlet. I like to edit things. I like to record things, make people laugh. So it started as little snippet videos, just kind of documenting my life as a Division I athlete. That sort of gave me a solid 6,000 followers. And then that summer, going into my junior year, the editing and the meticulous of making my videos look aesthetic kind of got old because I was like, I'm really not that aesthetic. So I just was like, I'm going to be the weirdo that I am online. My friends all know that I'm a weirdo. So I propped up my phone and personified my audience and started calling them Jim and, made them feel like they were my friends. And then I just was like, all right, Mom, I think I can get to 10K followers by the end of the summer. And I did that. And that's when my mom was like, okay, 10K is kind of cool, but you're going to school for PR and advertising. So And like, dad's helped me get your insurance internship. And I'm like, I know, but this is what I think I meant to do. Junior year, I garnered like 50,000 followers. That's when I sort of got back to school and people were like, Jim, we love you. And I was like, holy shit, I have some fans. I never knew this would happen. Excuse my language. And then 52,000 followers. I got reached out to by Barstool. Someone had been watching my content for like 3 months that I didn't know, 2 months maybe. And they're like, we think you're a great fit for our content social intern. Obviously, I know Barstool Sports is a huge company. Dave Portnoy, very smart businessman. So I was like, I'm just going to do this. This is better than working in insurance and doing their flyers. So I like totally took the leap and it was uncomfortable. But the only way to grow is to be uncomfortable. So I commuted every day from like May 31st to August 18th. And when I left Barstool, I was like, my goal is to get to 100K and to like be employed. And I got to 100K and then they asked me to be full time. So from then we went back to senior year and the rest is history. I really like, it was so great like being my senior year because a lot of people are like drop out of school. And I was like, I'm going to finish my damn degree if it's the last thing I do. And it was hard, but I did it. And now I'm full time. And that's an adjustment too, because now I'm like, wait, I have way more free time than I think I need. So that's sort of how I got a role. And it's the best thing ever. And I'm very blessed and couldn't have done it without my best friend here, Delaney, keeping me sane throughout the way.
So would people think about TikTok or any social media platform, Instagram, X, Facebook, whatever, and they hear somebody's making a living on that? I think for people who are maybe we're not raised on social media, they don't get it. How's that possible? So in the case of TikTok, this is something that's exploded really on the scene in a relatively short amount of time, really fast adoption and growth rate, fastest of any social media app. How is it that you are able to make a living on something like that? And do you think of it as a job? Do you think of it as something you're just going to do for a while and then get a real job? I mean, how do you think of it?
Yeah, so I totally see it as a real full-time job. I'm lucky enough because I work for Barstool that I'm on a salary with them. So they also pay me to create content for them. But also being a full-time content creator is totally like the real deal. Like I have brand deals that I need to hit a deadline with. That's mainly how people make their money on TikTok. And it's just such a people want to work with TikTok content creators because the engagement and the little girls or boys who watch these women like me or the people who have more followers than me have so much pull on like the generation. Like someone puts one product in a video and it sells out the next day. So it's like that sort of thing where like the influencer marketing and the engagement and the reach of these people and the whole time is like super high up there. So yeah, I see it as a real job in the way that like I have to make a brand deal and it's maybe not as well at the end of the month you're getting this. It's maybe on July I'll make this and in August I'll make that, but it is totally the real thing. The hours are definitely different. I'm not going into the office 9 to 5 every day and like I don't by any means have to as long as I'm like still creating content, being myself. And
that's like any entertainer. I mean, an actor doesn't have normal hours. A singer doesn't have normal hours. Artists don't.
Yeah.
So, I mean, do you think, that's really what you are, is you're an artist creating content?
Yeah, my own thing. Totally. And they do a commercial and granted they're bigger, but like still the same thing. I'll prop my phone up and then I send it to them. I'm like, how does this look? And on the table for content creators who are starting this journey. That's why a lot of people are getting into it. And that's why a lot of people struggle to get past that micro influencer phase because there's a lot. It's a very saturated thing now because people know you can create a lot of money on there. So once you break into that like 500 range, it's like, all right, I can do this. And then I tell my parents, they're like, oh, okay, So it's really cool. And it's a new thing. It's a very new, it wasn't a job before. So it's a big adjustment, but we're taking it day by day.
And I will say, in terms of the hours spent, being an influencer, Maddie, I think you do take a lot of pride in what you do. And the hours I see her editing these videos, I'm like, wow, that is something I could never do. But anyways, to go kind of back to the TikTok ban, what are your thoughts on this? Do you even think about it day to day? What would your life look like potentially if this went into effect? Just a little bit on that.
Yeah, the TikTok ban was totally something that threw me for a loop when it came up because obviously it's my job, it's a life. I don't think about it on the day-to-day because I think living my day worrying would be not beneficial at all. But I do think that if it were to be banned, I would just have to pivot. I just have to start a YouTube. I'm going to start a YouTube Yeah, so in regards to making longer form content, I'm in the works of doing that with YouTube and other, maybe a podcast in the future. So I don't think TikTok is, I'm not putting all my eggs in the TikTok basket. Obviously, I would need to pivot if it were to get banned, but I do believe in my followers to like find me on the new platforms and follow me there. And as much as there's TikTok money, there's YouTube money, there's podcast money, brand deals, there's a bunch of things in that. But obviously, I'd be sad. Like if it was to go forever, I'd be like, all my hard work. It has everything on there. Videos of Delaney and I when we're like in freshman year.
What do you think people should know about TikTok that they don't? And when I mean people over 30, say, or over 40, what do you think that audience, that crowd, and you heard the numbers, you know, a lot of people that are older support the idea of banning it, or at least having it be forcibly sold to an American company. What do you think they need to know or should know about TikTok that they may not know?
I think that they should know that it's not as bad and as scary as they may think. Like, it's really a wonderful creative outlet for a lot of people. I mean, the Olympian, even Ilona Maher, was just in a post-game interview after her rugby game being like, she's literally a U.S. Olympian, and she was saying, like, TikTok is so creative for me. Like, I love doing it, and maybe people are judging me because I'm also playing a sport, but, like, I need that outlet because I'm not going to put all my focus on the Olympics and how pressure and all this stuff. Like, people needed to like just release their mind. It's just mindless scrolling sometimes. Yes, there's the argument of brain rot and we're not learning anything on there, but there's also a whole STEM section where you can learn about science and all that stuff. I think people in those older generations make it out to be some big bad thing, but it's really, there's some really positive people on the app. Granted, there's some people who maybe shouldn't have that, but there's little girls can learn a lot on there and can see positive influences and see powerful women and see their favorite people. Like maybe they watch the Olympics and their favorite athlete has TikTok that they can get to know them personally and like them on there. So I think they need to know that it's not that scary. It's fun. They can laugh on there, giggle, maybe create their own videos.
It's definitely important to remember, like you said, Maddie, that it is a creative outlet and that it's not always a big, bad, scary place. And who knows, maybe I'll make my own TikTok someday and step on the scene as Mubi's sidekick. And thank you so much, Maddie, for joining us today. And I'll give you the opportunity for a second to tell people where they can find you.
So on TikTok, my name is Mubi, M00BIE. On Instagram, I'm at Maddie Schrader 3. YouTube is coming to the scene soon. But yeah, those are my two main forms right now. So
Sorry, I don't want to end yet because I want to know, where did the nickname Mubi come from?
yeah, a lot of people ask me that. It's really like not an exciting story. I was in high school and I was just trying to find something that was catchy. I used to do like M-Dog, but then I was like, I don't like that. This guy named Will did Woober. So then I was like, maybe I'll do Mubi with 2 zeros. I don't know if Will knows that he's the origin, but.
Well, don't let him know. He might want some dollars or something for that. So, don't let him know.
I won't.
Anyway, thank you so much for coming on and helping us better understand what TikTok's all about.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.
So I have big shoes to fill today. Lee is not here to do the fun fact, but we're just going to jump right in and ask the question from 1998. Do you have an email address? This was a survey that was conducted by Market Strategies, Inc. The sponsor was the Americans Talk Issues Foundation. And that survey back again in 1998 was 69% of Americans said they did not have an email address, and 31% of Americans said yes, they did. That's kind of hard to believe these days that proportion of Americans would not have an email address. Hunter, why don't you jump in?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, and I hate to be, of course, the one with a very unique situation here, but I may have 6 separate email addresses at the moment. So when it comes to answering the question, I definitely have an email address. But 30 years changes so much. I mean, we go from never even hearing about email addresses to people that do have multiple email addresses and need to have multiple just to go about their daily life.
Let's be fair here. You and Delaney were born after everybody had email addresses. Like your parents, when you were born, your parents emailed your birth announcements to their friends, right?
Yeah, that's
Right.
a good point.
I mean, Delaney, you've never lived in a world that didn't have email, right?
No, I mean, I think I've had an email since high school going in, but my dad still does not have an email. as he lives, works, and breathes in the trees. So he works for DEC, so he really has no
He doesn't have a work email?
Yeah.
A state work email?
I mean, like maybe, but I have never seen that man use an email and like under any forms you have to fill out your parents' email. I just leave it blank.
Wow. So did either of your parents have AOL accounts? You've got mail.
I was just going to say, I don't even know what AOL is.
Okay, we can end this segment now, Mary.
Please. Well, I will say, it's funny because when I was in college, email was just starting. I really hate to even admit that. And I really thought that this wasn't going to stick around. So, I was one of the late adopters, and now I can't imagine life without an email address, especially since so many of my kids' school communications come through email. Jay, what about you? Thinking back all those years.
I think my first email address, technically, the earliest email was in the 70s, even 80s. A lot of people in certain situations had emails, but there was no real internet. There was no internet on which to kind of use email outside of organizations. First email I had professionally was at ABC, and that was partway through my time there, and it was a big deal. We were getting emails. We didn't have computers that could receive them, but they were giving us email addresses. It was kind of funny. But yeah, I actually have probably 10 or 12 emails, Hunter. I have more than you do, but about half of them are spam ones that over the years, I've turned into spam ones and lost them for use for any real purposes. So I don't even check them, but they do exist out there. Email's gone from something that was, wow, never heard of it 30 years ago, to a very useful thing, to now something that an awful lot of people kind of dread, It's like all spam.
Oh, Jay, come on, but what about all those sale advertisements you get from your email?
That'll do it for Poll Hub this week.
Poll Hub is produced by the Marist Poll at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York.
Mary Griffith is our executive producer. Casey Schaff is our production supervisor.
The Poll Hub team includes Athen Hollis, Delaney Hayes, and Hunter Petro.
If you enjoy Poll Hub, consider telling a friend about us.
If you'd like to learn more about polling and survey science, check out the Marist Poll Academy, our free online learning portal.
If you have questions for us, tweet them at us at Marist Poll.
Remember, you can always tell your smart speaker to play Poll Hub, and with any luck, it'll cooperate.
And finally, wherever you listen to Poll Hub, there is a subscribe button.
Click it, and the latest episode will be ready for you
In your podcasting app as soon as it's released.
We'll see you next time.